For 35 years, they remained hidden in darkness. 82 prints so shocking that their creator, Francisco Goya, never dared to show them publicly. Locked away in a Madrid studio, these images held a truth so powerful that authorities feared them. Today, we're uncovering the story of the most controversial artwork ever created during wartime, a series that changed how we see human conflict forever. This is the tale of the disasters of war and the risk that nearly cost one of history's greatest artists everything. To truly understand the revolutionary nature of Goya's work, we need to travel back to the Spain of the early 1800s. The country was caught in a perfect storm of political upheaval, military invasion, and social collapse. Napoleon Bonaparte, fresh from his conquests across Europe, had set his sights on controlling Spain, seeing it as a crucial piece in his empire-building puzzle. In 1708, through a series of clever political manipulations, Napoleon forced the Spanish king Charles IV and his son Ferdinand VII to step down, placing his own brother Joseph Bonaparte on the throne. This wasn't just a simple change of leadership. It was the beginning of a nightmare that would last 6 years. The Spanish people's response was immediate and fierce. What followed wasn't a traditional war fought on neat battlefields. It was a brutal guerrilla conflict that turned every village, every city street, every mountain pass into a potential death trap. The Spanish term guerrilla, little war, would enter the global military vocabulary from this conflict. French soldiers, trained for conventional warfare, found themselves fighting shadows. Spanish fighters would strike without warning, disappearing into the landscape before retaliation could come. The French responded with brutal reprisals against civilians, creating a cycle of violence that seemed endless. Meanwhile, the civilian population suffered horribly. By 1811, Madrid was in the grip of a devastating famine that would claim 20,000 lives. Food supplies were cut off, medical care was scarce, and the basic structures of civil society began to crumble. What made Goya's approach so revolutionary was his complete rejection of traditional war art conventions. Before the disasters of war, military art followed strict rules. Battles were depicted as grand spectacles, with heroic generals on rearing horses, brave soldiers in pristine uniforms, and dying warriors in noble poses reminiscent of classical sculpture. These paintings were meant to glorify war and celebrate national pride. Goya threw all these conventions out the window. Instead of heroic battles, he showed us the aftermath. Mutilated bodies strung up in trees, civilians being executed, women fighting desperately to protect their children from soldiers. His figures weren't noble warriors, they were terrified victims or brutal killers, often indistinguishable from each other in their violence. He also broke with tradition in his technical approach. Rather than using color to create dramatic scenes, he worked in stark black and white, using the etching technique to create harsh contrasts that emphasize the horror of his subjects. His compositions didn't follow classical rules of balance and beauty. Instead, they were often chaotic and fragmented, reflecting the disruption of war itself. This was unprecedented in the history of art. No artist before had dared to show war with such unflinching honesty. There was no propaganda, no glorification, no attempt to justify the violence. Just the raw truth of what happens when humans unleash their capacity for cruelty on each other. This approach would influence generations of artists and war photographers, setting a new standard for truthful depiction of conflict. Let's take a closer look at how these 82 prints tell their devastating story. The series opens with sad forebodings of what must come to pass, showing a man kneeling in darkness with arms outstretched, a haunting prophecy of the horror that follows. From there, Goya takes us on a methodical journey through the landscapes of war. The first 47 prints focus on the immediate violence of conflict. We see executions happening in broad daylight, tortured bodies hanging from trees, women fighting off soldiers with makeshift weapons. One particularly haunting image shows a baby trying to nurse from its dead mother. Goya doesn't sensationalize these scenes. He presents them with a documentary-like precision that makes them even more disturbing. The middle section, plates 48 through 64, deals with the famine that devastated Madrid. These images show emaciated figures searching for food, bodies piled in the streets, and families dying together. There's a print called Cruel Tale of War that shows a woman carrying a child's corpse, the horror evident not just in the subject matter, but in the mother's vacant, traumatized expression. The final 17 prints become more symbolic and satirical, using allegorical figures to criticize the authorities who enabled such suffering. We see wolves dressed as priests, monsters teaching lessons to donkeys, and truth lying dead on the ground. It's as if Goya, having shown us the physical horror of war, now wants to expose its moral and spiritual corruption. But the images alone weren't enough for Goya. He added another layer of meaning through carefully chosen words, captions that would turn these prints into something even more powerful. These aren't just titles. They're integral parts of the work that often add layers of bitter irony or moral commentary. Consider how he handles one of the most brutal scenes in the series, a print showing mutilated bodies arranged on a tree. Instead of a dramatic title, he simply writes, "This is worse." The understatement makes the image even more powerful. Some captions are darkly sarcastic, like, "This is what you were born for," accompanying a scene of mass execution. Others are direct accusations. "Why?" appears beneath a scene of torture. The caption, "I saw this," appears several times, transforming Goya from artist to witness and forcing us to confront these scenes as documented reality rather than artistic invention. Perhaps most chilling are the captions that point to the futility of war. "There is no remedy" appears more than once, suggesting a cycle of violence that can't be broken. And this, too, introduces yet another scene of brutality, implying an endless parade of horrors. These words don't just describe the scenes, they force us to think about our own responses to violence and our complicity in allowing such things to happen. The combination of image and text creates something entirely new in art history, a form of visual journalism that would influence everything from war photography to modern graphic novels. While Goya's captions cut deep psychologically, it was his groundbreaking technical approach that made these images possible. He primarily used a combination of etching, aquatint, and dry point techniques, pushing these methods to their absolute limits to achieve unprecedented emotional effects. The process was incredibly demanding. Each plate required multiple stages of work, with acid baths between each stage to create different levels of tone and texture. Working with these printing techniques wasn't just technically challenging, it required thinking in reverse. Every line Goya carved into his copper plates would appear reversed in the final print. He had to plan meticulously, considering how each shadow and highlight would appear, while maintaining the spontaneous, immediate feel that makes the images so powerful. In some prints, he used burnishing tools to create highlights by smoothing out the copper plate, while in others, he used multiple bitings of acid to create especially dark, rich blacks. The wartime conditions made his technical achievements even more remarkable. Materials were scarce. At times, Goya had to cut larger plates in half or reuse old ones, burnishing down previous images to create new ones. He sometimes worked with inferior quality paper and had to adapt his techniques accordingly. Yet these limitations seemed to push him to greater innovation. He discovered that by varying the wiping of the plates between impressions, he could create different atmospheric effects, adding to the psychological impact of his scenes. Yet for all his technical mastery and artistic courage, these prints would remain unknown to the public for decades. After Napoleon's defeat in 1814, King Ferdinand VII returned to power and established a repressive regime that would have viewed Goya's work as dangerously subversive. The prints didn't just show the brutality of French invaders, they depicted Spanish fighters committing atrocities, criticized the Catholic Church's role in supporting oppression, and questioned the very nature of authority itself. Publishing them would have been suicidal. Ferdinand's regime had reinstated the Inquisition and was actively persecuting liberals and reformers. Goya, already under suspicion for having worked for Joseph Bonaparte's government, kept the prints hidden, showing them only to a select group of trusted friends. He stored the copper plates in Madrid when he finally fled to France in 1824, leaving them in the care of his son. The prints wouldn't see public light until 1863, when the Royal Academy of San Fernando finally published them. Even then, some images were considered too controversial. In one print showing a pope walking a tightrope, the figure was changed to a cardinal to avoid religious controversy. The first edition of 500 was printed with great care, though later editions would show wear on the plates and loss of detail in the aquatint areas. When these prints finally emerged into public view in 1863, they sent shockwaves through the art world. You can trace Goya's unflinching approach through the history of war photography, from Matthew Brady's Civil War photographs to the work of modern photojournalists. His combination of reportage and moral commentary created a new model for how artists could respond to conflict. Contemporary artists continue to engage directly with Goya's work. The Chapman brothers created an entire series based on the disasters of war, recreating the scenes as three-dimensional dioramas. Pablo Picasso's Guernica draws directly from Goya's vocabulary of artistic protest. Recent artists dealing with conflicts in Palestine, Syria, Ukraine, and other war zones often cite Goya as an influence on their approach to documenting atrocity. The technical innovations Goya pioneered also continue to influence printmakers. His sophisticated use of aquatint to create tonal effects, his combination of different techniques within single images, and his understanding of how to use the printing process itself as an expressive tool remain influential in contemporary printmaking. The enduring power of The Disasters of War lies not just in its graphic depiction of violence, but in its profound psychological insight into human nature. Goya shows us not only what war does to bodies, but what it does to minds and souls. Each print becomes a mirror forcing us to confront uncomfortable truths about human capacity for both cruelty and suffering. Consider how relevant these images remain today. When we see Goya's print of civilians being executed against a wall, we can't help but think of similar photographs from more recent conflicts. His images of refugees fleeing violence could have been taken yesterday. The print showing a woman protecting her child from soldiers speaks to a terror that remains painfully current. What makes these works particularly powerful is how Goya refuses to let anyone off the hook. He shows us that in war, the line between victim and perpetrator often blurs. In one print, we see Spanish guerrillas torturing French soldiers. In the next, French troops executing Spanish civilians. The cycle of violence continues endlessly, with each atrocity breeding new revenge. This understanding of how violence perpetuates itself feels remarkably modern. Goya's genius was in recognizing that war isn't just an event that happens to people. It's something that reveals what people are capable of doing to each other. This psychological insight makes his work timeless. Whether we're looking at conflicts in Ukraine, Syria, or anywhere else in the world, Goya's prints help us understand not just what we're seeing, but what it means for humanity. His work shows us that art can be more than just aesthetic. It can be a moral force, a way of bearing witness, and a call to conscience. If you enjoyed uncovering the risque secrets of art history, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel.